와. 식사. 꽃 좀 주세요. 이거 먹어. 너무 맛있었죠. 네, 이제 더 열심히 일할 수 있을 것 같아요. 이번 주 게스트는 주한 캐나다 대사님 데이비드 차터슨이죠. 근데 올해가 벌써 한국과 캐나다 수교 50주년이라면서요.
정확히는 지난 1월 14일이었고요. 올해 그래서 캐나다 대사관 주관으로 전국에서 많은 문화 행사가 열린대요.
근데 수교 이전부터 캐나다와 우리나라의 관계가 좀 예사롭지 않았다고 들었는데 굉장히 깊은 관계가 있었다고요?
그 한국 최초 영안사전을 편찬한 사람이 제임스 스카스 게일이라고 캐나다 선교사였어요. 1888년에 편찬을 한 거예요.
근데 한국 전쟁 때도 미국 그리고 영국에 이어서 세 번째로 많은 군대를 보내준 나라가 캐나다라는 사실을 아마 많은 분들이 모를 거예요.
그리고 그 세브란스 병원 교수였던 스코필드 박사는 심지어 3.1운동에도 참가를 해갖고 외국인으로 유일하게 국립현충원 애국지사 묘역에 안장돼 있어요. 몰랐죠?
오, 몰랐는데요. 갑자기 캐나다가 그 친하게 느껴지는데요.
캐나다는 이민자들이 만든 국가로도 좀 유명하잖아요. 어떻게 보면 우리가 아까 먹었던 피자에 그 여러 가지 토핑, 피스가 있는 것처럼 모자이크와 같은 나라인 것 같아요.
우리나라 이민자들 되게 많잖아요. 지금 한 20만 명 정도 되는데 그 교포사회 중에서 네 번째로 큰 규모라고 해요.
주변에서도 아이들 유학 보낸다고 하면 캐나다 요즘 많이 보내더라고요.
그 캐나다 유학 중인 학생이 현재 2만 5천 명을 넘었대요.
제가 알기로는 근데 캐나다가 천연면이 되게 많은 걸로 알고 있는데요.
그 에너지 생산량이 세계 5위고 석유랑 천연가스 매장량도 3위래요.
그럼 캐나다에서 수입하면 좋겠네요. 왠지 싸게 해줄 것 같은데?
친하니까 싸게 줄 것 같아요. 안타깝게도 근데 우리는 거의 중동에서 많이 수입한다고 해요. 근데 생각해보니까는 최근에 캐나다 FTA 이야기도 있지 않았었나요?
맞아요. 요즘 우리나라가 FTA 시장에서 굉장히 인기래요. 그래서 많은 나라들이 우리나라한테 손을 내미는데 캐나다도 그중 한 나라고요.
캐나다가 우리나라랑 어떤 무역 분야에 관심이 있는지 좀 알아보고 싶어요. 저는 에너지 수입하는 거 되게 좋거든요.
조피디는 관심도 참 많아요. 근데 조피디의 관심이 국민의 관심이라고 생각하고 제가 한번 협상을 잘해볼게요. 네.
근데 대사님 부인이 일본 분이세요?
네, 주일 대사로 계실 때 만나서 결혼했는데 동양 문화 적응하는데 그 많은 도움이 됐다고 그래요. 뭔가 만남이 되게 로맨틱한 것 같더라고요.
어떻게 만나셨는지 좀 구체적으로 물어봤으면 좋겠어요. 사랑 이야기 여쭤볼게요. 재밌을 것 같아요. 근데 우리나라 문화에 대해서도 굉장히 관심이 많다고 들었어요. 그래서 대사님의 한국 문화 사랑하는 한국 문화가 무엇인지도 한번 여쭤볼게요. 그러면은 이쯤에서 키워드를 한번 정리를 해볼게요. 캐나다니까는 붉은 게 빨간색을 할게요. 자, 첫 번째는 뭐가 좋을까요?
한국하고 아주 오래전부터 인연이 있으니까 그 얘기 먼저 들어보면 재밌을 것 같아요.
한국과 오랜 인연. 그리고요.
그리고 캐나다의 한국인들.
또 뭐가 있을까요?
저는 경제 교류요.
경제 쪽에 관심이 있었죠. 그리고 마지막 하나 놓는다면은 한국 문화 관심도 이렇게 하면 어떨까요? 이 정도면 충분하겠죠? 채터스님 대사님과의 대화. Foreigners have long played a part in Korean history. 150 years ago, a foreign missionary helped compile the very first Korean English dictionary, and King Gojong's personal physician was a man named Oliver Avison. Both men were from Canada. Well, here to talk about the long and close relationship between Canada and Korea is Canadian Ambassador to Korea, Mr. David Chatterson. Ambassador Chatterson, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Teresa.
Our pleasure. Well, this is a very special year for both of our countries, I hear. It's the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between our two countries, and I hear that the Canadian Embassy has been planning a series of events to commemorate the special occasion.
We have, actually. We call it Celebration 2013 because as a 50th anniversary, it only comes up once in one's relationship. So you mentioned earlier the relationship we've had between our two countries. It goes back a long ways, more than 100 years. But diplomatic relations started 50 years ago. So to celebrate that, to raise the profile of our country in Korea, and frankly Korea in Canada, we decided to elevate this year and have a whole year-long program of activities and events to kind of showcase what Canada is and to highlight where we think we can do more together. That's really what it's about.
Can you tell us about some of the more special or memorable events that you're planning or have already?
Certainly. We had in January a recreation of a hockey game at City Hall. During the Korean War, our soldiers, who Canadians love hockey, played hockey on the Injim River during the Korean War, and there were some very famous photographs taken of that. So we recreated the game in cooperation with the city of Seoul, right in front of City Hall. We, this past weekend, had a Banff Mountain Music Film Festival. Again, working with the city of Seoul. We are, in a few weeks' time, having a Cirque du Soleil, which is a Canadian group that performs acrobatics in music and theater. It's extraordinary if you've never seen it. And we have a variety of musical events. We have artistic events. We have art shows with Sukmyung University. It's a whole series of events. All available, the schedule's all available at www.celebration2013.kr.
Great. Well, we look forward to those events. And I hear that Korea has officially designated this year as the Year of Canada, and Canada in its turn has designated this year as the Year of Korea. So what sort of events are being planned in Canada to celebrate this special relationship?
We are working very closely together because my job is to promote Canada in Korea. Ambassador Cho's job, which is Korea's ambassador to Canada, is to promote Korea in Canada. But we have become friends, and we've realized that the way we can best do our job is actually to promote the relationship. Because where we can find win-win situations, we will get traction and forward momentum. So Ambassador Cho last year had several events, and this year will have several events to kind of raise the profile and to commemorate. And there's similar events. There's musical events, there's a film festival, there's a Canada-Korea forum that we're going to have in Ottawa later in the year, which is more of a political discussions. So it's a similar kind of range of events and activities.
Right. And I know that over the years, people-to-people exchanges between our two countries have increased dramatically as well. How do you see our relationship right now?
How do I see our relationship?
And the people-to-people exchanges in that respect?
I think actually it's the people-to-people that provides the greatest foundation. You mentioned a couple of our kind of famous Canadians here. Dr. Gale, who did the first Korean English dictionary and actually also did the first translation of the Bible into Korean. Dr. Schofield was a member of the Samuel group and is buried in your National Cemetery as one of the participants for independence in 1919. So we go back a long ways, but the real foundation of the relationship is current people-to-people relations. And we have some 220,000 probably people of Korean origin living in Canada. Koreans started to emigrate in the 60s and 70s in particular, and that has just continued. And we welcome them. We love Koreans. We love them as immigrants. We love them as visitors. On the flip side, we have about 25,000 Canadians here in Korea, including 5,000 Canadian teachers. So we start at an early age and connect, I think, on a person-to-person basis, and that forms long-lasting trust and relationships.
Can I ask you a blunt question?
Sure.
And please be brutally honest as well. What do Canadians really think of Koreans?
Good question. I'm a diplomat.
Yes, I know. Taking that into account, as blunt as possible.
What do Koreans think of It's very difficult when someone asks me a question that begins with, what do Canadians think? Because Canada is, we call it a multicultural country. We're a country that has been created by immigrants from around the world.
Right.
So there is no Canadian. There is a Canadian society comprised of different perspectives, different religions, different origins. So there really isn't a Canadian view per se. I can say that many Canadians' impressions of Korea are based on things like they see Koreans as being very pragmatic, being very energetic, very hardworking, very focused on education, very good golfers, particularly Korean women,
Yeah.
and increasingly very creative. Your Psy has made quite a splash around the world, in Canada as well. So I think I would say that Canadians' impressions of Koreans is becoming more textured, more complex, the more exposure we have to each other.
Right. As you say, there are so many Koreans who are now living in Canada. They've become Canadian citizens and become part of that multicultural society. But in the same respect, I think Korea as a whole wasn't that well known, the country itself, outside of maybe Asia or a couple of countries. But do you think now with Psy, with this multifaceted sort of image of Korea that is now coming out with, I guess, its rising economic power, more Canadians are becoming interested in Korea as well, not just the Korean society in Canada?
I think yes. I think Canadians have a thirst and a hunger for understanding more about the world because our neighbors come from all around the world. So from a very early age, we're curious about other societies, other cultures. Korea, for the longest time, wasn't frankly noticed very much. You have a difficult geography. You live in a neighborhood with very powerful neighbors, and quite often they cast a shadow.
Right.
Similarly, Canada has a very powerful neighbor. And sometimes when Koreans look to North America, you see the America, but not always the North. So I think that's a challenge both countries have. I think we are emerging out of the shadows of our neighbors. And I think we are finding more and more that we like and appreciate and understand in each other's cultures, each other's societies, as time goes on.
And you mentioned that Canada is a very multicultural society, and Korea is not quite there yet, but it is becoming more and more multicultural. And there are very good aspects of that, but I'm sure you've also noticed some negative aspects of that have been cropping up in the news. What sort of advice would you give to Koreans to better assimilate all these foreigners into our society, more harmonious society?
Oh, you've got some really good questions.
The easy stuff is coming later.
My. What would my advice be? I think it's very simple. My advice on embracing diversity is that you have to fundamentally embrace it. It's not a question of tolerating differences. We have to create a society in which people seek out differences and appreciate differences. And that's challenging. I mean, Korea is a Confucius-based society that is pretty homogeneous. So I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge. It's a challenge in societies like that to embrace the differences that comes with multiculturalism. But the more exposure you have, the more you travel, the more you seek to understand and appreciate differences, I think the richer Korean culture is already rich, but the richer it will become. It's all good, actually. Certainly that's been our experience in Canada.
So we mustn't perceive it as a threat, but as a plus, or it could be a big benefit.
But you should have great confidence in your society and in your culture. It's thousands of years old, or thousands of years young. So I wouldn't see it as a threat at all. It's more a question of learning how to accept and value differences. I'll give you an example. In Korea, there's great pride, and justly so, about Korean cuisine. And it's a rich cuisine. In Canada, people say, well, what's Canadian cuisine? And my
Not just Canada. Sorry.
And my answer is, well, actually, I think Canadian cuisine is the best the world has to offer, because we have immigrants from all around the world. We don't expect them to become Canadian per se. We expect them to bring the richness of their society, of their culture, of their cuisine. So some of the best Thai food, or Vietnamese food, or Chinese food, or Korean food you can eat anywhere, you find in Canada.
It's true. I've experienced that firsthand, actually. Yes. Well, the Canada Festival celebrated 50 years of diplomatic ties between Canada and Korea. We're going to take a look at those festivities now.
Canada, Korea, let's get it on.
Canada's beautiful, and yeah, people are really nice, and yeah, so I like it a lot. Yeah, definitely.
We have, of course, many Koreans in Canada, but we're seeing an increasing number of Canadians coming to Korea as well. How would you explain this interest in each other's countries?
I think the interest is a consequence of our getting to know each other. As you say, there's many Koreans in Canada and have been there 30 or 40 years to an extent. Canadians are more recent visitors. We were here 100 years ago. We were here 60 years ago during the Korean War. But more recently, it's been our teachers that have been drawn to Korea. We have about 5,000 Canadian English language teachers here in Korea. But they change. They're here for a year or two or three. So we think there's probably somewhere in the order of 70 or 80,000 alumni that have been here and gone back to Canada. There's one of our members of parliament was an English teacher here 12 years ago, and he loves Korea. He's a huge fan. So people with experience share their experience with their friends or colleagues or relatives, and then those people go, I think I'll go to Korea and check it out. So it becomes a positive experience that's shared and grows. And I think that works both ways. I have met so many people from Korea that have studied in Canada for short terms or long term. In fact, almost everyone I meet over a certain age has had either a family member or a friend that has studied in Canada.
Okay. And you actually witnessed firsthand how much Koreans are interested in Canada because you're at a high school in Gwangju, right? Can you tell us about that experience?
That was one of the best experiences I've ever had in Korea. I try to do what I call outreach to high schools and universities throughout Korea to better understand Korea and to kind of connect with people. So this was the first high school I went to speak at. And I walk in, I get a standing ovation. I felt like a rock star. It was a great feeling. And then the kids, and they were kind of grade 10, 11, gave presentations on Canada, on Canadian music, Canadian culture, Canadian economy, Canadian history. Wow. And they were great. Not just content, but creative and funny. I just loved it. It was a lot of fun. So then I gave my talk, and then afterwards we just started talking. We had about half an hour of questions and answers and chatting. And that's where I really enjoyed it, because I could see this desire, this hunger, this thirst for understanding more about Canada. In some cases, some of the students had studied in Canada, so there was an appreciation of Canada. We just kind of connected on a very personal basis. It was a great experience.
Wow, sounds very special. So, talking to these young students, what do you think was the draw for them wanting to go to Canada then? Is it the nature? Is it the slow, relaxed pace of life? What was the draw for them?
I think it's varied, but I think one thing that draws younger children to Canada is their parents. because their parents quite often are focused on education. And Canada has a very good reputation for education, but in particular it has a very good reputation for success. So when you're from Korea and you go abroad, and all of a sudden you go into an English school, that can be a pretty scary kind of thing.
Right.
And again, in Canada, because we're multicultural, we're used to people from all around the world. We're used to people speaking English with a bit of an accent. Everybody speaks English with an accent in Canada. So that's fine. Students are very successful, particularly Korean students, are very successful in Canadian studies. So I think that's part of it, is the education mamas. Know this, understand this, and find Canada very safe, a good place for their children to undertake education.
Okay. Well, despite the very vibrant people-to-people exchanges that we've been talking about, economic exchanges relatively have not been so vibrant or so thrust in the spotlight so far. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a few reasons. I think the first reason is that when, for the last 30 years probably, Canadian business has been focused on Europe and the US. We did a free trade agreement with the United States almost 30 years ago now, and that provided us access to a market 10 times the size of Canada. So we've been doing extremely well in those markets for 30 years. Korea, I think, was focused primarily on economic growth. So we didn't look to each other that much. In more recent years, Canada has understood better that it is not just an Atlantic country or a North American country, it's also a Pacific country. And we've been looking to Korea more often, looking to Asia more, I would say. In the past few decades, it's been Japan, China, and Korea third. Korea's been rising, and our understanding and attention toward Korea is rising. And the same thing has happened in the other direction. Korea has had a very long relationship and close relationship with the US, which is understandable. In more recent years, Korea has looked to Canada as a partner in energy, as a partner in resources, and as a partner in certain areas in technology. So I think the relationship is becoming a bit closer and a bit more mutually beneficial. Our challenge is to just kind of open our eyes and pay attention to each other. And I think if we do that, we will both have benefits for our citizens in both countries.
So you mentioned a couple of fields that could be, especially that we can focus on for economic cooperation: energy, resources, and IT. What sort of relationship do you see for a win-win relationship between in those fields?
Okay. There has been kind of a revolution in energy in North America. They call it the shale gas, tight oil, fracking. You've heard those terms?
Not really.
We have unlocked an incredible amount of oil and gas in North America through new technology. Combined with that is what we call the oil sands of Alberta. Canada is home to the third largest reserves of oil in the world. We think we have natural gas for 200 to 300 years in the future. So we're richly endowed with this energy. But to use this energy, we have to unlock it. We have to invest in infrastructure, in pipelines, in liquefaction, in transportation. And for that, we see Korea as an absolute natural partner. We are rich in resources. We are looking for long-term customers, and we're looking for long-term partners, investors. Korea, on the other hand, is energy dependent. 96% of your energy is imported. When Koreans start to look at Canada, they say, this is a country we can actually invest in, because most countries that have oil and gas, you can't invest in. It's state-owned. Our market's open. Korean companies also look at it and say, we can invest in pipelines. We can invest in gas liquefaction. We can invest in ships. So it provides commercial opportunities as well as energy security. So I see that as as a marriage, a perfect partnership where our needs and your needs are met by the other person for long-term benefit. So that's one area, I think, that holds great promise. And we're seeing it. I mean, there's probably $6 billion so far invested by Korea in the energy sector. There's lots from Japan, lots from China, lots from Europe. But this is probably the largest area for Korea in Canada.
I think I read somewhere that Canada exports most of its energy to the U.S., is that right?
To the U.S.
So to export your energy all the way over to Asia, to the Pacific, that would require a lot of money. And is that something that is beneficial for Canada to do, to export, to lay those pipelines, all that investment, really? Why not just ship close across the border to U.S.?
Well, we would if we could.
Oh.
You see, the U.S. has also used this technology to unlock greater oil reserves and gas reserves in particular. So Canada is and will continue to be the largest supplier of oil to the U.S. We're far larger than Saudi Arabia or any other country. That'll continue. But we have more. We have more oil than, frankly, the U.S. needs. So that's one part. The other part is our gas. We have all this incredible riches of natural gas. Well, the U.S. has discovered their own now, so they don't need to buy it from us. So we're, as I say, we're looking for long-term customers and partners, because the pipelines and all that infrastructure is very expensive to build, but provides benefits for decades.
I don't know if it's just me that was ignorant that Canada is the largest producer or supplier of oil, larger than Saudi Arabia. Is it because Canada is modest? Why did we not know about this? I don't know why we didn't know.
That's one of our most endearing qualities.
I think it is.
Our modesty, actually. Yes.
It really is. Well, let's talk about the FTA negotiations between Korea and Canada, which have been stalled since 2008. I know beef was a huge sticking point, but how do you see future prospects?
Well, I think we're in what I would call the end game. Trade negotiations continue along. You leave the more challenging issues to the end, and you have kind of general agreement but not final agreement until everything is agreed. And to get to that final end, you have to have a political decision to say, yes, this is what we want. So I think we're getting close to that. I think we're moving into the political realm as opposed to the trade negotiators themselves. In my view, it's an absolute natural. Our economies are not directly competitive in most areas. In fact, our economies are very complementary, such that we produce things that you don't have, you produce things efficiently and effectively that we can't. So there's again, a natural symbiotic economic relationship there if we choose to understand it and pay attention to each other. And I think that understanding is growing. In my mind, a free trade agreement, and I used to do free trade negotiations for my sins years ago, but a free trade negotiation is more about a declaration of commitment and interest in the other country. Certainly it reduces tariffs and reduces barriers, but it really is saying, I want to have a long-term relationship with you. It's like going steady, so to speak, leading to marriage perhaps, who knows. But it's a declaration of intent. And that's why I think it's so important, because I think our relationship has got to that point where we need to decide what we want to do with it. And the free trade agreement would be a strong declaration of the desire we both share to move it together down the road to mutual benefit.
How far down the road do you think it'll be? A year, maybe two?
Oh, I hope it's done this year.
Done this year.
I mean, this is our 50th anniversary.
It'd be nice.
Yeah, it'd be a nice anniversary present for both of us.
Well, actually, quite a lot of countries have been interested in forging FTAs with Korea. What makes Korea so attractive? Why is Canada, why are so many countries wanting to do this?
Korea, in recent years, has chosen to go towards a different economic model than it had followed for, well, the past 40, 50 years. And in more recent years has really decided to become a hub, connected to the value chains of Northeast Asia. And to do that, it needs to have free trade agreements. It needs to have free trade agreements with Europe and the US, Southeast Asia, countries like Canada and Australia, and Northeast Asia. I think the interest is that Korea is a bit further ahead than Japan and China in this. China's got a very large market. It is not as important to China. It's not nearly as dependent on trade as Korea is. Japan has got a very large market. It's actually not as nearly as dependent on trade as Korea is. But Japan's not ready, in my estimation. It's not moving as quickly as Korea is. So other countries see this and they say, oh, yeah, we can do this. The thing to remember about free trade agreements is that they benefit both consumers and producers. They provide lower prices, more choice to consumers, which is good. We're all consumers. And they provide lower costs and more choice to producers, which make your producers more competitive. And that's what it's really all about.
Well, Korea is making so many FTAs, and there's always reports in the media, 1 year anniversary of this FTA, what are the pros and cons, have we exported more, have we imported more, and they're always doing this balancing act. Do you think that's productive?
No.
No. Why not? Isn't that what most people would see? This is the benefit of doing an FTA. I see it, simply stated in plus and minus.
I think you can do that over a longer time period. But over a shorter time period, you can't do it because there's so many other factors that come into play, including exchange rates, including economic growth in the world, all kinds of things. When we did our free trade agreement with the United States, we had a kind of a wine industry. We made terrible wine. But we had a lot of farmers that grew grapes and made terrible wine. And it was very protected. And they did not want this free trade agreement at all. We went ahead and did the free trade agreement, and we gave them some money to tear out their low-quality vines and plant good quality grapes. 10 years goes by, we have duty-free access into the US. We have a $100 million wine industry. So,
good wine now.
Yes, very good wine, including ice wine that we export to Korea. So that, I think, is a good example of the benefit of a free trade agreement, one that we benefit from, the U.S. benefits from, because they have access to really good Canadian wine. But it also allows us to kind of move up the value chain and spend more time and effort making higher quality products. And the same thing, I think, will be happening here in Korea. So you need a bit longer timeline to really understand the value, and things don't change that quickly. It takes longer.
So no pali-pali, a little bit more slower,
Yes.
take a longer.
For this one, no pari-pari.
Pali-pali, okay. Well, Korea and Canada have been fascinated by each other for a long time. And now let's take a look at the Canadian Embassy in Korea. The Canadian Embassy opened in 1974. The embassy building in Chunggu sits back a step away from the street. And there's a special reason why.
There is a special reason for it, actually, and it is this. This tree is 520 years old. So we bought the property about 20 years ago, and we designed the embassy around the tree. So you see the embassy sweeps around like this and creates a kind of a plaza here so that we stay back from the tree. In fact, during construction, we made a special point of doing the heavy work during the winter when the tree was dormant. And as you can see, it's very good shape.
There's a grand Schofield Hall when you enter the embassy. On July 1st, the embassy hosted a reception to celebrate Canada Day. The hall is named for a Canadian figure in history. But who is Schofield of Schofield Hall?
Well, Dr. Schofield came to Korea in, I think, 1917. He was here as a doctor. He actually helped open some of the schools and universities here. But he was most known for his role in the 1919 independence movement against Japan on behalf of Korea. part of the Samil group. And because of that, he is the only foreigner that's interred in the National Cemetery here in Korea.
The Gale Lounge, used for meetings and gatherings, is also named after a special Canadian.
We call this the Gale Lounge. It was named after James Gale. James Gale was a missionary here in Korea, and he was quite well known for two things in particular. One, the first Korean English dictionary ever made was made by James Gale. Second thing was he was the first one to translate the Bible into Korean.
Canada was an ally and participated in the Korean War. Diplomatic relations began in 1963. The friendship between the two nations has only grown deeper in the last 50 years. There was a performance by a Canadian pianist and Canadian food for guests.
Special foods, Canadian foods. You know, food for any country is really important. It's important for Koreans, it's important for Canadians. We're very fortunate because we have a very large country with 3 oceans surrounding us. So we have Canadian beef, Canadian pork, Canadian lobster, Canadian snow crab.
Economy, culture, and society. Canada and Korea have supported each other in all areas. We hope the future is as bright. Well, Ambassador, thank you for that tour of the Canadian Embassy. One feature that really stood out is the green roof. I heard that you're saving energy through that, and of course, energy saving is the key word in Korea right now. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, that was an initiative actually of the fellow Jeffrey Dean, who runs our political economics section. And a couple of years ago, the city of Seoul had a program where they were encouraging different building owners to make more ecologically friendly roofs. So we worked with the city of Seoul. We invested ourselves an amount of money, and we planted. We put a new roof on and built these boxes and planted a whole series of plants, grasses and flowers and the like, which absorbs carbon dioxide, absorbs heat, and most amazingly provides a habitat for bees and birds. I've been up on the roof several times, and every time I go up there, there's bees flying around and birds. It's absolutely delightful. It's quite amazing. And if you look at it from an aerial view, you can see all the different colors of the plants.
It's amazing.
I'll send you a photograph.
How much energy does it save?
Oh, God, you got good questions. How much energy? I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I think it certainly does save some energy. It provides a cleaning to the air. It provides a natural habitat in a city that's mostly concrete. And I think it sends the right signal that we care and that you can do this.
Right. So you came to Korea in the fall of 2011, but you mentioned you had been to Korea several times before. And I hear that you actually asked to be appointed to Korea. Why?
Why not? Yes, I had 2 postings to Japan, one in the 80s and one in the 90s. And during those years, I covered a variety of files in Asia. So that meant I came to Korea, I think I came to Korea about 18 times in the 1980s and 1990s. And it was a very different Korea. But over that period of time, I saw how Korea was changing. And I was fascinated by those changes. So when the opportunity arose to come back, and to come back as ambassador, I said, that's the job for me. So I convinced my bosses that I could do a good job there, and it was a job that I very much wanted to do. The reason I wanted to do it is because, again, I felt that we had unrealized potential. There was just so much richness in our 2 countries' relationship, potential richness, that I wanted to help unlock that. So that's really why I wanted to come.
So you had to fight off the competition to come as a Canadian ambassador to Korea. Now that you've actually lived here, visiting and of course living are 2 very separate things. How are you finding it so far?
Well, it's a little colder in the winter and a little hotter in the summer than I remember, I must say. The traffic in Seoul, I think, is worse than it was 10 or 20 years ago. What do I find? What I find a fascinating culture, frankly. I find a much more confidence. I find a Korea much greater confidence than 10 or 20 years ago. And you have this interesting mixture of a Confucius foundation coupled with this absolute cutting-edge modern approach, including technology, but beyond. So it's this fusion of the two that I find uniquely Korean and uniquely fascinating, frankly. That's one. The other part is this can-do. We can do anything. This pari-pari approach to, well, let's just do it. Let's get it done tonight. and that, you know, I find very encouraging. It's very exciting. It's interesting to be around people like that.
Well, and I understand that you're also Canadian ambassador to North Korea. Have you been to North Korea? How are you carrying out that part of your title?
Yes, I am Canadian ambassador been named Canadian ambassador to both North and South Korea. However, we began a whole series of sanctions and trade embargoes with North Korea as a consequence of the sinking of the Chonan.
3 years ago.
3 years ago. So since that time, we have not had any visits, diplomatic visits to North Korea or any visits from North Korea to Canada. So I have not been able to go to present credentials. My sense is when we can have a greater prospect of relationships between the two countries, that would be a time to re-examine our approach.
Okay. Well, I'm talking to Ambassador Chatterson of Canada, and we'll be right back after this.
It's a magnificent country. My suggestion is go out of the cities. I mean, Seoul's a magnificent city, but for a different experience, try out the nature. Earlier this year, Yona Kim was skating in the figure skating championship, the World Figure Skating Championship in Canada. But when she won, there was a local choir that had learned and practiced your national anthem just in the event that she won. And she won, they sang. It was a very emotional moment, I think.
You've described Canada as the kind of country that you want to be friends with, and I really think that Canadians, wherever they go, they are welcome. They are embraced as friends. It's an amazing feat, I think, and something that you must be very proud of. Could you tell us how you do it? How are you so universally liked all over the world?
Well, we're so modest. That's a good question. Again, I think it goes back to the fact that we're a very multicultural country. So we're very confident in who we are, but we also at the same time don't think we're the best in the world. We think the world is a very rich place from which we can learn a lot. So when we go out, we don't go out and say, oh, we're Canadian. We go out and ask questions. We go out and seek knowledge and seek experience. And I think that's appreciated all around the world. No one wants to be told, you know, we're great. So we don't do that. That's just not in our nature. We're typically very modest, very polite people. But this brings to mind one situation. I was in France. I used to work with the OECD for several years. And I remember traveling all around Europe while I was there. And quite often I would see people with Canadian flags on their backpacks. And I would go up and say, oh, hello. Half the time they were not Canadian. They were from other countries.
Right.
But they said, oh, no, it's good to have that Canadian tag. And I thought, well, that's nice, but I'm not sure if copyright is correct on that.
I remember, yes, even when there were certain demonstrations in a certain country in our country, I think some foreigners were advised almost unofficially to wear Canadian flags on their clothing, or so it's become a little badge or symbol of peace, I think. peace. We mean no harm.
But you know, the other half of this too, though, is that I think Canadians are also very principled. We have a sense of what is right and what is wrong on a universal basis. And we're not afraid to say that. We're not afraid to stand up for what we believe are principles. And that's similar to, for example, what we did in the Korean War. That was not our war.
Right.
We had no, as they say, no dog in that fight. But we were there for principles because we thought democracy was important, freedom and liberty were important. So we're nice, but écoute.
We could be firm when we want to. Well, I think it's a great lesson because especially Koreans and young Koreans do want to play a bigger role on the global scene. I think we have many lessons to learn from our Canadian friends.
Well, and you have much to contribute. Don't be shy about contributing. Don't be shy about going out. That would be my suggestion.
Okay. Well, since we are celebrating 50 years of ties between our two countries, Canada and Korea, do you have any last words for our viewers, especially our Korean viewers?
Last words. Well, I would suggest that this could be a year for you to examine, to explore Canada. It's a big country. There is lots there. Come in the summer, come in the winter, come anytime. You'll be more than welcome, and I think it'll be a great experience for you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chatterson, and thank you so much for making time to come on the show.
It's a delight. I have the highest respect for Arirang, and it's been a real pleasure working with you, Teresa.
We hope to see you again.
I look forward to it.
Thank you. Well, that was Ambassador David Chatterson of Canada, and you can watch a rerun of our show on our homepage, arirangtv.com. Until next time, bye-bye.